From Eyewitness News, this is Newsmakers.
He was the youngest murder victim Providence has seen in 6 years. A 14-year-old gunned down simply answering a knock at the door.
Whoever did it is a coward. You know what I'm saying? Got the wrong person. I know it wasn't for him. It was for somebody else.
Can cooler heads prevail before the streets of Providence see more bloodshed? Our guest for the first half of Newsmakers from the Institute for the Study and Practice of Nonviolence, Teny Gross. Then, with $2.5 million in his war chest and improving poll numbers, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse is heading into campaign season on decent footing. But he's an incumbent at a time when it could be hard for politicians to convince voters for a do-over. A little-known conservative challenger is hoping to tap into that discontent. Our guest for the second half of Newsmakers, Republican candidate for Senate, Barry Hinckley. Good morning. Welcome to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. Joining me on the panel, my colleague, WPRI.com reporter Ted Nesi, and political reporter for Rhode Island Public Radio, Ian Donis. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Teny. Thank you for joining us on the program this morning.
Thanks for having me.
First question, I want to start with the homicide that we began the program with. Your street workers can sometimes get inside information because they generate trust from the neighborhood. Are we any closer to knowing who shot and killed 14-year-old Joel Figueroa?
Unfortunately, I really have to respect the line of the police. They're the ones who are doing investigation. Anything I can say can actually jeopardize an investigation and be against actually the interest of the family.
Let's talk about a lot of what your street workers do, and that is to try and stem violence. Because of that shooting, and you heard a very angry young man in the beginning of the program here, are you concerned about street justice in this case?
There's always a concern. I think we wrap the family with supports from our victim services, from our street workers, from our juvenile reentry program. We stay very close. If something like that happened to me, there would be a lot of anger. I mean, it's just a human nature. So supporting the family, helping guide them through that it's a process. Grieving is, no one can predict how long it takes. So I never judge a family when they're in that situation. Just what we can do is support, and it works. It always works.
So, go ahead.
Teny, you've been working to reduce violence in Providence for almost a decade. Over that time, we've seen the number of homicides go down by quite a bit. There were 30 in 2000. The city is currently at 12. What have you learned about what police and your institute can do to make a difference in reducing violence?
This is not a comfortable week to brag about a great model. It is just very, very painful what happened. We lost a 21-year-old young woman, a 14-year-old boy. Yesterday, Boston was visiting us. Boston is the original model of partnership, the architecture nationally. Next week, Atlanta is visiting us, right? This is constantly happening. Eric Holder was here in the summer. Providence has probably the best architecture, one of the best in the country, right? So we don't want to dismantle it. The mayor is very committed to it, to those partnerships. It's not just the police and the institute. You got the hospitals, the schools, other providers. So what we got here works. What I don't think we ask very often is, what's the right dosage? What if the budget of Crossroads is over $10 million? What if the institute had that budget? Right? Would we do work? What we don't have enough is dosages. What if we could hire more gang members? More people who are offenders? It works. It saves money to the taxpayers. I think that is really the direction I'm starting to think more about.
What is your budget?
At the moment, it's $1.7 million and struggling.
So where do you see more revenue coming from then?
I think it's really getting a buy-in. Budgets, as George Nee says, it's really an interaction of what is a priority. It's what we as a society decide is important. For example, if Rhode Island Hospital told you, I can cure your cancer, however, I cannot afford doctors, we would do something about it. We will have doctors to show up for your cancer operation. At the moment, we don't do that with violence prevention and intervention. Not enough. As a society, not just Providence actually invests more than other places. I would like the state to start putting more money into this. In Illinois, they're the biggest funders of Chicago violence prevention. Providence does a lot. I think the state, I want to engage now the state in a conversation.
Doesn't the state already provide Providence with millions of dollars? Isn't it, I guess I'll ask it another way, isn't it
more of a priority of Providence then? And even more so, not to beat a dead horse, every week we talk about pensions on this show, but isn't it an argument for why bad pension systems have such an impact on budgets? Providence, every month, puts $7 million into their pension system. So is it less about coming from the state and more about the city prioritizing where it puts its money?
Well, my ideological colors are going to come out now. I think Kachieri was starving the cities. Republicans starved cities. I think the mayor is not too happy how they were left out of the pension reform. Look, this is the capital city, right? 1 in 5 citizens lives in Providence. 1 in 3 maybe is every day in Providence. 40% of reentry coming out of jail comes to Providence. I think that's what A.T. Wall mentioned, or one of the mayors mentioned this week in a reentry summit. Are we really paying the city for coming in here, wanting to use its services, driving in its cities, on its roads, and really the fact that we are the absorption center of a lot of people who are coming out of jail? So I don't think, actually, I don't. I really do think the state needs to do a lot more.
What's the goal, Teny, in terms of, you know, there are going to be people watching who say, well, you're never going to get rid of violence on the streets,
Not
especially
true.
in an urban area. So when you think about the goal of where you would like to get to, where we aren't yet, what you would do with those extra funds, would it be we'd get to 0 in terms of the number of homicides in the streets? Would it be, what would it be? What would success look like?
There's absolutely no reason on the planet why the richest country in the world is exceptional only in 2 numbers. We're not exceptional in car theft, we're not exceptional in break-ins. We're exceptional in suicides and homicides, which come close because of guns. We're exceptional in that. You cannot do all those other investments in education, in roads, in businesses, while you have a war. In Sarajevo, they didn't care about test scores when they had a civil war. Our murder rate in the United States is the equivalent the last 30 years to Northern Ireland. You got to stop the war. Absolutely, we can reduce it. Already in Providence, gang homicides are lower than other cities.
To follow up on your point about guns, how much success has the city had over the last decade in reducing the amount of guns, and how much power does the city really have to impact that, something like that, where federal laws also come into play?
Absolutely. Guns come from Georgia, from New Hampshire. Providence this year confiscated a lot more guns than the previous year. So they're doing the right thing. You're right. Legislation should change. Guns are a big issue. There's the other part of it where I do agree with the NRA that guns don't kill people. People do. What we need to do, what completely works, we have now all the research, all the track record from Boston in the 90s, now in Providence, relationship and employment. Offenders very often feel the pressure of the police and the legal system, the Attorney General, and then they want the carrot. We need to strengthen the carrot. The pressure is there. The police and the Attorney General are providing good, ample pressure on those gangs. What is missing, when I want to change, do I have those avenues with less skills, with a criminal record? Do I have the avenues to change? It's cheaper for us as a society, and we need to finally go and commit it, which is what other societies do.
What about the future of the police department? I know you can't talk much about the hiring process for the next chief of police because you're involved, but generally speaking, what are you looking for in the next colonel for Providence?
I think what we're looking for is really to continue the partnerships, a chief that appreciates community policing. It makes a big difference, the network. A police is not an occupying force. A police is really a civil part of our society. And what has been built here in Providence has been studied by other cities. And that's what we're looking in the new chief. I think some of the candidates really have that, so I think we're going to be in a very good shape.
Teny, I want to ask you about the Providence Community Action Program, ProCap. You served on the board there. When were you on the board?
It was a while ago, and Mayor Cicilline put me on it.
Do you have any sense of the years?
I don't, because I haven't been engaged at least 3 or 4 years.
Mm-hmm. Were you on for a long time when you were on?
There was a short period where I was really going to meetings, and then as the Institute was taking over, I really asked that I cannot serve.
Did you have any indication things were awry there? Any management concerns? Anything when you were sitting on the board you said, this doesn't seem quite right? I
did not. You know, I mean, I wasn't on any executive committee. I was kind of a general person. At the time, I really believe in bread and butter kind of programs. I thought there were some things that are done well. A little bit of a concern for me is sometimes when we referred people to try and get heating and that, there was really always this kind of waiting list and waiting list. But I attributed it also to budget risk constraints, you know. So
but in fact, we've now
get
seen the budget for weatherization and fuel money soared in recent years at ProCap, even though people were saying they weren't able to get the funds.
Right.
Yeah.
No.
And
I support, you know, Councilman Salomon, President, really in his efforts, and I think Frank Shea is a superb choice.
Head of the Olneyville housing.
Right.
Do you support the call, knowing what you know right now, for Frank Corbishley to step down?
You know, I work a lot with people who are, you know, innocent until proven guilty. I don't think I have enough information. I'm no longer involved to say that categorically. But what I think is the people that now I put in charge, I trust that they will find out what needs to be done. And Frank is one of the better directors. He's someone I look at as a mentor to me.
In terms of strengthening the carrot, if you were philosopher king, what would you do to create more jobs in Rhode Island? We've seen how the state has struggled with that for seemingly forever. So what would you do?
You know, I really think when we had the stimulus debates a few years ago, not now, but actually initially, people were talking about roads, etc. And I thought, why are we going back to the 1930s? Today's stimulus would be actually, let's engage ex-offenders, let's recycle people in the economy. Let's actually, the new infrastructure in America actually is education and getting people to work with youth so we don't have that failure rate. So rather than roads and infrastructure, the infrastructure today is we have too many people who are not finishing school, who are not educated, who are unemployable, who have criminal record. I would hire more youth workers, I would hire more teachers. That would be what I would invest.
Teny, we have about a minute left. I want to go back to the police department. You were close with former Colonel Dean Esserman. He resigned, as we all know, after an underage drinking party at his house. What was your take on how he left and how that all ended up?
I was not happy that someone who has put so much of his heart and has brought such intelligence and really attracted national attention and brought $27 million. I was not happy at the constant drum that happened in some circles in the media that was constantly attacking him personally.
Why do you think that was then?
I mean,
so it was unjustified in your eyes?
Well, partially was really not aimed at him initially. Partially we're pretty mean, you know, and I hear that from other politicians as well, on both sides of the aisle. Those personal attacks. People are public servants. They take a toll for our society. We need to respect that.
Some of those stories came from people in his own rank and file. The perception is his relationship with the men and women of the Providence Police Department had devolved. Do you agree with that? Had it gotten to a point where maybe he couldn't manage anymore? I
think there was a deterioration, but again, some of it was, is it a chicken or the egg kind of a thing? You know, you're constantly getting attacked every day, every day.
Did you ever see that famous temper you hear so much about with Colonel Esserman?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, he has a temper. He's very passionate. I mean, I like a chief that is obsessed with solving problems. He would come sometimes 8:30 in the morning on a Saturday. You know, I couldn't sleep last night. What if we try this? That's what you want in a public servant, that kind of a dedication. Is he flawless? No, he was not flawless.
Teny, we have to go. I appreciate you joining us on the program. Teny Gross from the Institute for the Study and Practice of Nonviolence. Good luck out there. When we come back, Republican candidate for Senate, Barry Hinckley. Stay with us. You're watching Newsmakers. Welcome back to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. To my right, WPRI.com reporter Ted Nesi, and from Rhode Island Public Radio, Ian Donis. Our guest for the second half is Republican candidate for Senate, Barry Hinckley. Barry, I think it's, first of all, welcome to the program.
Good to be here.
I think it's safe to say that people know very little about you. So why don't you give us a brief background on yourself?
Well, they know more and more. Every month our visibility goes up. But background, I moved to Rhode Island after college in 1991. I grew up in the marine industry, which of course Newport is oft considered the epicenter of the marine industry here in the Northeast. I moved here to work for the family business. I'd been a yacht captain working on our family boats for a couple years, and I moved on shore, so to speak, in Newport in 1991 and entered the family business then.
According to the Newport Board of Canvassers, you registered in Newport in June 2010, and you were unaffiliated. You were an independent. You voted in the Republican primary in 2010, then you went back, filled out a form to remain unaffiliated, then registered to become a Republican just February of this year. Why should fellow conservatives have any faith in you as a Republican when your voting record showed that you just became one in February?
I left the Republican Party. To finish my story, I actually ended up moving to Massachusetts for a job when the boat business, the marine industry, cratered during the luxury tax in the early 90s. There was no more work. I, like many Rhode Island kids, had to leave to get work, and I ended up in Massachusetts. I was a Republican there, and I became unaffiliated because I was disgusted with what I would call fiscal irresponsibility of the second Bush administration, and I no longer felt I was comfortable in that party because of the massive size the government was becoming under his leadership. So I became unaffiliated. So when I moved down to Rhode Island, I remained, or moved back to Rhode Island, I remained unaffiliated. However, what I see today in the Republican Party, and the reason that I'm excited about running as a Republican, is I see a party that is willing and open to external criticism of themselves. And what I mean by that is Republicans are willing to have an open dialogue about their shortcomings in public. And that is constructive, I think, and that is healthy. We have a party that is willing to say, you know what, we've done things wrong in the past, there are better ways forward, and I like to be part of that open dialogue, and that's why I'm comfortable being a Republican today.
Just to wrap that up, I want to be clear on something. You said you moved to Massachusetts, but you are actually registered in Florida, correct?
I actually, when I moved back to Rhode Island at the end of '09, permanently, I actually relocated here in '06. On a temporary basis. My son was born at the Newport Hospital in 2006, and I commuted, but I remained a Mass resident because that's where I stayed during the week. I still have a house there. When I moved back in '09, I didn't plan to become a candidate for U.S. Senate. I planned to get another job when I left my software company. Unfortunately, the market here in Rhode Island is not good for getting jobs. It's horrible. I had been working on a part-time basis in the health food industry, the raw whole food industry. I spent a lot of time around health and nutrition in that sort of transition year out of software and looking for the next job. And I was working for a company at that time based in Florida. And I thought I was going to be working for them full-time and be relocating to Florida. And I actually began the process of relocating to Florida. I realized during that I really would rather stay in Rhode Island, and I decided that instead of finding another private sector job, the best way forward for me and my family was to fight for Rhode Island and a better future for my kids here. So I actually didn't end up moving to Florida like many people do for work. I ended up staying.
They say money is the mother's milk of politics, and you are at a severe disadvantage to Senator Whitehouse. Let me show you a picture of the comparison. Senator Whitehouse, you can see there on the left, has $2.6 million on hand as of September 30th. Your campaign had just under $150,000. How do you overcome that kind of enormous advantage that the incumbent has?
Well, to me, it boils down to what you're selling, what kind of product you have. We have a great product. We have a jobs product. I'm a job creator. I've created hundreds of jobs in the private sector. Rhode Island needs jobs. I've been out campaigning for 8 months now, selling my message of job creation. People love that message. Now we do have to fund that message. It's a marketing deal like any other product you're selling. You need to market the product. You do need money to market the product. But as my campaign gathers momentum, we are raising more and more money, and we will have the money, I am confident, to market this message. We won't need to spend as much money as he can gather, because he's an incumbent. And incumbents do what incumbents do. They basically raise a lot of money in exchange for favors. A lot of those favors end up in the tax code or earmarks or the other things that they've done to keep their jobs. It's easier for him to raise money, but I will contend that we have a much better message, and we won't need as much money as him because we're selling a better product.
Barry, you mentioned the Republican Party of today, so I'd like to ask you about that. We see how Republicans in Washington are obstinately opposed to any tax increases as part of efforts to cut the deficit. Even Republicans such as former Senator Alan Simpson of Wyoming have taken the GOP to task for that. So is the Republican Party in Washington the party of obstruction? Is it being held hostage by Grover Norquist?
Certainly, there's too much status quo in Washington, D.C. And what you're talking about, Ian, I would agree with. And I would agree with the fact that, from this point of view, our tax code is desperately broken. It's 80,000 pages. So, in my opinion, any effort to continue to tweak something that's broken is a fool's errand to begin with. So trying to raise more money through a busted tax code, I think, is the wrong way to go. I believe, like Marco Rubio says, we don't need more taxes, we need more taxpayers.
Yet mainstream news organizations like USA Today have reported that Americans, the tax rate they're paying is the lowest since 1950. Certainly the IRS does not have many fans, but what do you say to that, this argument that Americans are being overtaxed is simply not true?
50% of Americans that file tax returns pay nothing, so you're right.
Wait a minute. Don't they pay something in local property taxes,
payroll taxes?
But Ian was talking about the federal tax code.
I know, but if you're going to say that they pay nothing, I mean, that's sort of a line that's often used.
Pay nothing in federal tax, right?
Federal income tax.
Income tax, yeah.
Because payroll tax for Social Security, Medicare,
payroll tax
everyone
is interesting because think about it. The payroll tax technically is something that you get a benefit for down the road, right? So it feels like a tax.
But don't you get a benefit for any tax you pay? In theory, you get a defense.
But it's more of a defined benefit, right? Social Security is a defined benefit. Technically, you're going to get something in the future for that tax back. You used to get a report. They stopped sending it out, but you used to get a report saying this is what you can expect. Same with Medicare. You can expect to get health care benefits down the road. So technically, you're getting a benefit for that. Now, you've raised a really good question whether those programs will be alive and well. For instance, I'm 45. When I retire, let's say I retire when I'm 70, which won't happen, but let's say I do. That's 25 years from today. That's the year 2036. That's also the year that the trustees of Social Security say that program becomes insolvent. So you have a program that I've paid taxes into, to use your terminology, for 49 years, essentially, 12% of my income if you take what my employer contributes and what I've contributed, and I may get nothing. So yeah, it sort of feels like a tax.
So what do you suggest? Let's take payroll taxes. That's the big debate in Washington right at this moment.
Right.
This question of whether to continue the reduction in the payroll tax cut and how to pay for it. Should we continue it, and how should we pay for that?
Well, once again, I believe it's tinkering around the edges. So as an employer, I would never hire someone based on a payroll tax holiday. I would hire someone based on demand for my products and whether my company was growing and I needed more people to deliver those services and goods. That's why people hire people. This is a gimmick. It's a short-term gimmick that's going to go away.
But it's a gimmick that's put money in people's pockets, in fairness. I mean, taxes would go up January 1st without an extension.
And what it's also doing is it's starving the programs that are already in trouble. Think about it. They're tinkering around the edges. Social Security went into the red last year for the first time, ahead of schedule, in part because we're starving it, the payroll taxes it needs to be funded.
Well, let's stay on
so we're creating problems, by trying to solve problems.
I'm interested in the tax conversation here. You have a national debt counter. I went to your website.
Yeah.
National debt counter, it's up more than $15 trillion, as we all know now. But, didn't your Republican colleagues have a lot to do with that debt? And keeping it on the tax conversation, the Bush tax cuts, what do you say to the call that some of the so-called one-percenters, most famously Warren Buffett, have called for legislative change that would reach deeper into their pockets? Should millionaires and billionaires, like even Republican Senator Collins from Maine, have called for, pay more in taxes to close that debt that you have ticking up on your own website?
I totally agree, to close that debt. And that's the argument.
Raise the taxes on the rich to close the debt?
Think about what they're talking about, because they're not talking about doing that. They're talking about raising taxes to create jobs. So the debate really is saying we want to raise taxes on the rich, right, and pump 5.6%, and pump that money through the government to somehow magically create jobs. There's not been any conversation about raising that money to pay down the debt. I've talked to many rich people, and many of them are very comfortable with the idea of paying more if they knew that money they were paying went to pay down the debt on behalf of our children. But it's not. They want to raise more money, pump it through the federal government to somehow create jobs. That won't work.
That's interesting, though. That's a more subtle argument than what we seem to be hearing a lot in Washington, which is just a flat-out no on new additional tax revenue. Some have said, Senator Coburn has suggested perhaps you can close some of these gaps and stuff, but it sounds like what you're saying is as long as it doesn't go toward paying for new spending or continuing current spending, you'd be okay with higher taxes.
I have talked to many people, but once again, I want to go back to the fact that tinkering around a busted 80,000-page tax code that General Electric pays nothing because they have an army of lawyers and filed a 57,000-page tax return. Think about it. 57,000 pages they filed. Millions of dollars spent to file it. We'll spend millions as a government to review it, and no money changes hands. That's a broken tax code. The small business guy that can't afford the fancy lawyers gets hammered. that is an indication we have a busted tax code. So I don't like the idea of raising taxes through a broken mechanism, which is our tax code. I like the idea of a fair, simpler tax code that spreads out the base a little bit, allows small businesses to compete more, and hire more people. And then if we could define how the new money is getting spent to pay down our debt for our children, which is our responsibility, and get away from the notion that the government creates jobs. Raising taxes to create jobs via the government will never work.
If Congress can't reach an agreement to reduce the deficit, there will ultimately be automatic cuts in the military. So do we really need 2 Virginia-class submarines to be built a year by electric?
30 seconds, Barry, left in the program.
I'm a big fan of mobile military assets, which favor Rhode Island. We have too many bases abroad. We can no longer afford to be the world's police force. I think that we need to close down foreign bases and invest in more mobile assets. And new submarines are mobile assets. They will help Rhode Island, and they will help us be a stronger, smarter military.
Holiday tree or Christmas tree?
Christmas tree.
All right. Barry Hinckley, Republican candidate for Senate, our guest for the second half of Newsmakers. We appreciate you joining us on the program. If you missed any of it, including our first guest, Teny from the Institute for the Study and Practice of Nonviolence, catch it on our website, WPRI.com. It's under the on-air section. For Ian Donis, Ted Nesi, I'm Tim White. We'll see you next week on Newsmakers. Good job.